Okay, so the next section is on stages of attachment, or the development of attachment. So it's page 72 and 73 in your textbook, and it's kind of the work that's been set in the booklet this week. So this follows on from caregiver, infant interactions, and it follows on from reciprocity and synchrony, and looking at kind of how we form an attachment. So there's kind of two things to look at here, and they're both by the researcher Schaefer, who is named on the spec. So this is something that could come up quite a lot. Now, in terms of Schaefer, you've got two things. You've got the stage theory, so the idea of the different stages of attachment, and then you've got the research, so Schaefer's study, so Schaefer and Emerson's study that looked into attachments. So you can be asked about research, so that's the study of the Glasgow children, and you can be asked about the stages. So stages of attachment, there's 4 stages. You need to know the names of the stages. You need to roughly know the age. That's not necessarily too important. It's just worth bearing in mind. If you've got this table in front of you, and then you've got the textbook in front of you, there's slightly different names for stages 1 and 2. So in your textbook, it calls stage 1 indiscriminate and stage 2 the beginnings of attachment. Here, obviously, stage 1 is asocial, stage 2 is indiscriminate. It doesn't really matter, just learn one set. So asocial is where they don't really have a person that they form an attachment with. Indiscriminate is where they start to form attachments. Specific is where they have an attachment with a caregiver, and multiple attachments is where they have attachments with other people. So it doesn't matter which set of titles you use. It's just working through to stage 4, where children will have multiple attachments. But the one that's asked about the most is stage 3, so this specific attachment. A specific attachment can sometimes be referred to as a discriminate attachment. It's an attachment with one person. It's normally the primary caregiver, and you know when a specific or a discriminate attachment has been formed, because the baby will demonstrate separation anxiety, so they'll cry when they're left, and they'll also develop stranger anxiety, so they'll get anxious if a stranger comes towards them. So that's stage 3. So either learn it as specific attachment or learn it as discriminate attachment. It doesn't matter. It's the fact you've got one specific person. So that's the 4 stages. So it's age-based, and it's kind of sequential. You go through stage 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4. It's quite a common exam question if you're given an example of a behaviour and you're asked what stage that child is in. So Annie cries when her mother leaves the room, and she doesn't like it when a stranger picks her up. Adam is happy interacting with lots of different people, but he likes to be cuddled by mom or dad when he's upset. Yasmin loves all of her family and can be comforted by any of them if she's upset. And Ben hasn't bonded with anyone, but is happy to be picked up. He will smile, laugh when interacted with. So it's quite common if you get an example of kind of one of these, and you're asked to match it up with different stages of attachment. So you'd argue that Annie either has a specific or discriminate attachment because she's demonstrating anxiety when her mum leaves, so separation anxiety and stranger anxiety when a stranger picks her up. Adam has indiscriminate attachments, or kind of the beginnings of attachment, or asocial, where he's quite happy. Yasmin has multiple attachments. And Ben is either asocial or kind of indiscriminate attachments. So it's a fairly common exam question if you're asked about children and the behaviour that they demonstrate. This is a theme throughout attachment. There's a theory by Ainsworth on the strange situation, where they tend to give you a case study of a child and then ask you how that child would behave. This is Schaefer and Emerson's study. It's a study on babies in Glasgow. It's an observational longitudinal study, so it happened over time. So it happened they were visited every 4 weeks up to a year, and the infants were aged between 5 weeks and 23 weeks. What Schaefer and Emerson did was they visited the mothers and their babies, and they asked the mother questions about their babies in certain situations, and the researcher observed the infant's response to them when they turned up to their house. They found that the baby was more likely to form a primary attachment to someone who responded to them more. So Schaefer and Emerson refer to this as sensitive responsiveness. So if the mother was the first person to go to the baby when the baby cried or the baby looked upset, the baby had formed an attachment to the mother. Babies had more intense attachments to mothers who responded quickly to them and interacted more with them. And the babies had strong attachments to those caregivers. So caregivers that were sensitively responsive and caregivers that interacted with them. They found that the infants were weakly attached to mothers that failed to interact or to mothers that took time to respond to them. So Schaefer and Emerson looked at the degree of attachment they had and also kind of the reasons for this degree of attachment. They found that, again, there was different stages of attachments, that they could have multiple attachments by 10 months old, but the child tended to have a main attachment figure by 18 months. And it's about responsiveness. It's not necessarily about the person who feeds the infants. And this is important because we can use it to criticize the theory later on that says that it's about the person that feeds the baby. So this is Schaefer and Emerson's actual research study. The AO3 for this research, it has good external validity because the researchers went to the infants' houses. However, it was done in the 1960s. So it's got low temporal validity. Meltzoff and Moore argue that Schaefer and Emerson didn't see lots of different types of attachment, that babies are social at the stages that Schaefer and Emerson claim they're not. And it's also a limited sample, so it's ethnocentric, it's culturally biased, it's hard to generalize from the sample of it. It lacks population validity. This is an exam question that came up quite a while ago. So Jenny is 7 months and is looked after by a childminder while her parents are at work. Recently, she started to show great distress when her mother drops her off. Referring to Schaefer and Emerson's stages of development, explain Jenny's behaviour. So you can argue that she's in stage 3, so she has a specific or a discriminate attachment. She's showing separation anxiety when her mother leaves her. Question 2, what would you advise them to expect from Jenny's attachment behaviour in the future? Well, Jenny would move on to stage 4, which is multiple attachments, where she should appear less anxious when her mother drops her off. So questions like this are quite common. There are 2 essays here, and the question in red underneath is what's the difference between these essay titles. Now, you really need to read stuff carefully in attachment because Schaefer is named, but if you remember, you can be asked about the research or you can be asked about the stages. So that first question asks about the stages of attachment. So you're describing the 4 stages and you're evaluating the 4 stages. And the second question asks you about the research. So you're describing the research and evaluating the research. Now, confusingly, I guess, Schaefer's research can be used to evaluate the stages. So the research itself can be used as an AO3 point for the stages, but these are 2 separate questions. And there is some evidence on Caboodle of some answers to these questions. There's some really good AO3 in page 73 of your textbook. The 4 main ones, 4 easiest ones to remember. In terms of the research, you've got the fact that the data is potentially unreliable and the sample is biased. And in terms of the theory, it's culturally biased, so it's ethnocentric. And because it's a stage theory, it's inflexible. Also use alpha gender bias here as well, because it's suggesting that mothers are better than fathers. Remember, if you do any of these AO3 points for your evaluation, try and elaborate on them, try and use appeal format or kind of top and tailing it. Make sure that you elaborate on the points you use and link it back. So link it back to either the stages, if you're talking about the stages, or link it back to the research if you are talking about the research. Now, the role of the father, it's something that can be asked about. Research suggests that it's about the fathers interacting with children and playing with them. However, fathers can obviously be primary caregivers, but it's about responsiveness. Now, there's a really good section on page 73 of your textbook that talks about the role of the father in a bit more detail. You don't need to know too much about it. Everything you need is in your booklet. It's worth knowing the AO3 that there are very inconsistent findings on fathers, and a lot of this is socially sensitive. It's because attachment research is quite old, and all the original research suggests that mothers form attachments and fathers are kind of secondary. They're just there to play, or they're just there to discipline. So when you look at the role of the father, some of the research tries to suggest that men are biologically less sensitive to babies than women are. But again, this is alpha bias. It's all suggesting that women are better caregivers than men. So that's the main issue and debate that you can use to evaluate this. Okay, next time we're looking at animal studies.